Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope that your week is off to a good start. Let me share my screen with you. We're going to talk about sampling today. Why is sampling important? When you decide which method you're going to use in research, whether it is going to be a survey or an experiment, or you want to do content analysis, you need to determine which sample you're going to use for your study. Who are your participants? What kind of content are you going to select? Now, why is sampling important? And if you think of a research project, such as a survey, how many people do you think you would survey for your research project? What is the number of people that you would survey? Or how many articles do you need to select to perform a content analysis? I must say that there is no specific answer to this question. It really depends. It depends on your research question, on the hypothesis that you're testing. It also depends on the population that you're looking at. So if you want to see how Americans feel about news media, do they trust them or not? Surveying 100 people and making generalization based on 100 people will not be sufficient. That's like a really small sample. But if you want to look at a small campus in New York and survey students, females, for instance, only about their um, news preferences, surveying 200 could be a good number, for example. So what is it that we do what are important steps in research, and why is sampling an integral part of this process? When we start working on a research project, the first thing that we need to do, we kind of have a question in mind, but then the next thing is, okay, but how am I gonna do my research? What is the method that I should select? How am I gonna look for the literature? Well, you need to search for what other scholars had to say about the topic that you're exploring. So that means researching literature. Then you will write a literature review, pose a research question at the end, and then you will select the method. So that is your next step. And as you look at the literature, that literature should give you an idea of what kind of method you should utilize, because if there was somebody else who dealt with the same issue, you could see from their study what method they utilized to collect data, and then that could be an idea for your research project. This is, for instance, when I did a study about anxiety and uncertainty and anxiety, uncertainty, and attitudes toward refugees from Syria. I also noticed that other researchers used surveys to assess this. Why? Because the most appropriate method for collecting data about people's attitudes are surveys. So you will look at these studies and you will kind of figure out which are some of the concepts that you're going to assess and how you're going to explain each concept in your literature review. And then you will select the method you will use to collect data. But at the beginning of that method section, you need to identify the sample. What is the sample that you're going to collect data from? I'm going to do a survey. Okay, but who are you going to survey? Or I want to do interviews, but who are the people you are going to interview? So how do we start in this process? First, we need to look at the population. Population basically contains every number, every one of the units that researcher has selected to study. So if we look at the first example I mentioned, Americans and their view of news media, do they trust them or not? So our population is every American citizen. Other examples include other population that you could assess is every man working for a New York based advertising agency. So that is population. Or every student at Pace University is population. Every US edition of a Harry Potter book, as I said, sample selecting doesn't only um, um, is not only about selecting sample for your survey, but it also means collecting a sample for your, if you want to perform content analysis. Now, let's take a look at the difference between census and sample. So population, to repeat, is every one of the units that researcher has selected to study. Census is a study of every member of a population. Sample, on the other hand, is just a selected segment of the population that actually represents that population. We believe that that sample would represent that population. So to go back to the study on campus and how you're going to select 100 or 200 people to collect data from, so that would be your sample. Let's assume that the population of students is maybe 2,000, and then you would like to survey 100 people and that represent that population and collect data from them and make inferences based on that data. What types of samples did we have? So you are now clear what the idea of sampling means. So I can't really survey everyone in the population, but I will make sure to survey people who actually represent that population. But how do we know whether they represent the population or not? There are two possible samples. One sample is non-probability sample, and this type of sample is based on a judgment of a researcher. So that sample does not represent the entire population, but we think if we collect data from the sample, we still have some, we could still perform some valuable analysis. Another type of sample, and this is especially used in research about people's, let's say, attitudes toward politics, political parties, if they want to make any inferences regarding any predictions regarding elections. This is a type of sample that organizations would use, and this is the type of sample that they would collect information from. Probability samples are generated by randomly selecting the sample units. Now let's take a look at both of these types of samples. On one hand, we have several different non-probability samples. One of them is convenience sample, and this is what you're most likely going to do for your research study. So you're basically going to rely on the people convenient to you. So if you're doing a study that involves students on your campus, then you will probably look for people who are willing to participate in your study, who are convenient to you. So let's say you have a survey and you just walk around the hall and say, you know, I really need to do this survey for my project for communication research class. Does anyone want to complete this short questionnaire, please? I really need it for class. And that's actually convenience. So you're basically running into people and they're just asking them to fill out your questionnaire. Why is it not random? Because they're not randomly selected. You're just basically asking people to do you a favor. So they are volunteers in a way in your study. When it comes to purposive sampling, it is based on the idea that a specific person will meet specific criteria the researcher may have. So your research, for example, could focus only on graduate students. So you will look to survey only graduate students. So you will find specific people that fit into this criteria. When it comes to quota samples, you select members of the population that represent the population, but this selection is not random. So you select, let's say there are 20% of males and 80% of females on this campus. So I'm going to make sure that in my sample, I have 20% of males and 80% of females, but they will not be randomly selected. Snowball sample is when a researcher relies on members of a network to introduce him or her to other members of the network. This is especially useful for studies about, for example, homeless people. You meet one person and then you want them to introduce you to others. Or if we look at, I remember that I got contacted once when my friend was collecting data about the journalists, and he actually asked me to if I knew any journalists who lost their job during this big great economic crisis in 2008, 2009. And just he wanted me to connect him with them. And then through those people, he would be able to collect other data. I did something similar when I was recruiting people for my another research study where I was basically snowballing down. I was just looking for people and asking them if there would be anyone willing to participate in my study. I wanted them to connect me to that person. So that is a snowball sample. Now let's take a look at this more exciting and more difficult sampling method. So this is not based on whether somebody just wants to participate, wants to volunteer, but this is basically a type of sample where people are randomly selected. So random sampling method means that you could be selected for a study. I could be selected. This is something that I frequently do with my students. So when I'll give you an example of what it means to select somebody randomly. So let's say I ask students who wants to present their project on this day, and then no one wants to say I will, or I will have one student, but I need, for instance, three. And then I would just take a list of students. I have, let's say, 20 students in class, and I just grab a list, and every student is under a number 1, 2, 3, 4 until number 20. Then I open this web page, random number generator, and I insert numbers from 1 to 20. And then I click on generate numbers. And that random number generator would generate one number from 1 to 20. And let's say the random number generator generated number 15. And then I look at the list and see who is under number 15, and then I select them to present a study. And I like this process because I think that it is quite fair. Now, aside from this sampling method, where you can just open a phone book and say, okay, now I'm gonna just pick people randomly and call them and see if they want to participate in my survey. Another thing that you could do is use stratified random sample. That ensures that all categories of people will be presented. So you want to ensure that if you look at people who have like diverse income in some community, and let's say there's 20% who have salaries whose income is like over $100,000. There's 20% of people whose income is from 70 to 100,000. Then people from, let's say, 40 to 69,000, and so on. So, and then you learn from the available data that there's 20% of these people, 20% of this, 30% of this. So you select people randomly, but just make sure that in your sample, all of them are represented the way they're represented in real life. So if we have 20% of people who are earning, whose income is like over $100,000, then you're gonna add them. You're gonna make sure that you have that percentage in your sample. So why is that number? Why is it more important from this random selection? It is because in this case of random selection, you could end up having, it could be, it is random, right? So you could end up having 40% of people who have over $100,000 salaries. That could happen. It is random, but that could still happen. And just to make sure that everyone is equally represented the way they are represented again in real life, then you're making sure to utilize the stratified random. I'm not saying that like a random sampling is not good. It's just like this is one of the ways to um, design a sample. Then systematic sample, you open that phone book and you decide that you're gonna sample every 10th person on that list. And cluster sample means that you could divide population into separate clusters and then select them randomly from the population. So let's say your cluster is this campus, and then on campus, you find a building, a dorm that from which you want to select people, and then you look at floors, rooms, and so on to like select this population from. So these are like two types of methods that you could use. So there's non-probability that is more like convenient sampling method. You can't make generalizations based on this type of method, but you could make generalizations based on random or a probability sampling method. Another concept that I wanted to introduce you to is sampling frame and units. Sampling frame basically means that sampling frame is the master list from which you are deriving this sample, from which you're selecting this sample. So that could be all registered member of a political party or all graduate students at the university. So if you're doing a study that involves only graduate students, you search for a list of all graduate students at your university, and then you can utilize one of those sampling methods to select the people that you're going to survey for your study. Sampling units are units selected from that study. Sampling frames could be based on several things, several variables. So one of them could be address-based sampling. So what does it mean? If we look at people used to send out surveys based on people's mail addresses, but you know how they move around. So now one of the things to ensure that you are actually being people who live in a specific address, you could use this address-based sample to look at people's addresses and then select people you would include in a specific state in your study, such as New York or New Jersey, for example. Telephone sampling frames, you could use a phone book and select people from the phone book, or internet sampling frames that could be a bit more complex. And all of these frames are could be challenging in a way, because if you look at internet sampling methods, it could be perhaps easy to make a sample based on this based on younger generations, but then there are people who are excluded, who are not that avid internet users. So how are you gonna sample them? So I believe that internet sampling frames would be appropriate if we were to study millennials, or if we were to study Generation Z, because they know that they're having internet users. So if we want to make inferences about that population, we could just try to select a sample from the internet to send out the survey, and make sure that we are collecting data from that population. Key concepts in this lecture. So sampling is actually an introduction to something that I'm expecting you to do this semester, and that is to collect survey data. But first, you need to figure out which population you're going to study, who is going to be your sample for the study. And for that reason, I wanted to explain these specific methods that you could use to select your sample. So remember, you're first going to look at the population. So assuming that you're going to collect data from campus, or perhaps data could be connected to your work, or you could collect data from people online. If you're looking at Instagram users, you could try to recruit people for your survey through Instagram stories or Instagram posts. So just figure out what the population is going to be. Are you going to look at Instagram users? Are you going to look at graduate students at Pace University? So what is your population census? Every member of the population probability sample. Remember, this is when everyone could be selected to participate in a survey and you can make generalizations. Non-probability is when we search for people who are convenient to us or people who are ready to volunteer to participate in our study. I also want to emphasize that you should search for sampling frame. So what is your sampling frame, and then sampling units? A sample frame, I guess, if you're searching for students who study, let's say, who are graduate student in Dyson College, you could search for a list of students and then just simple pick units, pick people that you're going, randomly select people that you would like to survey for your study. Now, at the end of this lecture, short lecture, I want to give you an exercise. So there are two things that I would like to do. As we're getting closer to this first portion of your final project submission, that is introduction, literature review, and method section, I want you to first explain in detail how you would select a sample for a study you are conducting. Would you opt for a probability or non-probability sample? And write about 200 words and post it under sample selection. I want to tell you one thing about the probability sample. One of the problems with the sample is that it is very expensive to collect data by randomly selecting people. It could be very expensive. With non-probability sample, many people opt for this option because you could simply try to recruit people online, or you could simply recruit people from your community. But the problem with this type of sample that we cannot make any generalizations based on the data collections. It's based a major limitation. As I mentioned, as we are approaching this, we are approaching the midterm, I just want you to do this exercise, and that is select 3 journal articles from the Communication Research Journal, write a reference for each article and add a DOI link to it. Post the exercise under writing references. I will provide document with APA style guidelines, so that should help you write these references. And an example of it, as you can see below, is protests on the front page, media, and media silence, institutional dynamics, and coverage of collective action in the New York Times. So you can look at an example here in case you want to read this article. It could be useful for some other lectures that we're going to have in the second portion of the semester. So for this exercise, the only thing that you need to do is learn how to write references. I want to prepare you for this. And with exercise 1, you should be prepared to write this first portion of the method section that will basically ask you to define and explain which sample you're going to use for your study. So this is my reference for today, and thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions for me, just send me an email. Thank you. Have a great week.